what I will try to convince you of in the next 3 or 4 hours is that politics and the economy and technology shape actions which have an impact, a lasting impact on the environment. And so that ignoring these factors is perilous for environmental history. Aluminum manufacture has a significant environmental impact. That is unquestionably true. The process to manufacture was developed in the 1880s, the middle of the 1880s, independently by 2 individuals, and it's true. I checked this twice. They were born in the same year, died in the same year, and came up with exactly the same process. And in fact, Hero held almost all the European patents, and Hall held almost all the North American patents on this method. The trouble was that it works because of the existence of this catalyst, cryolite, which was only available in Greenland. A way was developed in the 1940s to produce it synthetically. But it's that fluoride in it produces in the process hydrogen fluoride, which when it comes in contact with moisture creates hydrofluoric acid, and you don't want to be anywhere near it. It's very corrosive and dangerous, and then there's all this carbon that's in the pots that produce the aluminum, so there's a lot of bad things come from it. The biggest impact, though, and the point of what I'm going to talk about now, is energy. It takes lots of energy, lots and lots of electricity, and so the economics and the technology dictated that hydroelectric power would be used, and so Canada was a logical place for this to happen. Canada has, as Ruth said, extensive natural resources, an abundant natural endowment waiting to be exploited, and that was done by people even before Europeans arrived. And there was an historical pattern of exporting part of the resources to support the population. There was a series of goods which were exported. This is the staple theory of Canadian economic development and Canadian life from the arrival of Europeans. It goes to this economist at the University of Toronto, a man by the name of Harold Innis. And the country started by exporting codfish, then furs. Those are a couple of his books. First it was cod fisheries, then it was the fur trade. This was followed by timber and potash. Burn the trees before you send them out. Gold, and then wheat at the end of the 19th century. In the 20th century, there was a series of new staples, or a second wave. Frozen cod blocks, then pulp and paper, then minerals, and then energy. Oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric power. And in fact, you can see a big jump in exports of energy from Canada. Canada was a net energy importer until 1968. And there was an energy crisis in the 1970s, of course. But you can see that since then, there's been a massive increase in exports. Another factor that had an important impact on the use of energy to make aluminum was the national policy, which the government embarked on in 1878 when this man, Sir John A. Macdonald, was Prime Minister. The idea was to put high tariffs on industrial imports to promote domestic industry. The logic would be to add value to staples and then export the products. Instead of sending out the codfish, you should do something with the codfish before you ship them out. You should make the beaver hats in Canada instead of letting Europeans do that. And let me see. Oh, and I guess the connected one was you should use the electricity, if you had it, to make aluminum. The policy didn't exactly work out exactly the way it was supposed to in the case of aluminum. It was not straightforward. In fact, the story is a bit confusing. In part, it didn't work out the way Sir John A. Macdonald planned, was because of somewhat half-hearted government policies, in part because of the technology of making aluminum, in part because of an odd set of circumstances and personalities. People get in the way of history. It's a damn shame. But the end result was a massive aluminum industry, increases in electricity output to go with the aluminum industry, dams with the blocking of rivers, the rising of lakes, the flooding of people's homes, the export of bulk aluminum, and a unique investment structure and a unique organization of the industry, which Canada, in fact, actually exported, and which finally has come to an end only in the last decade or so. So, aluminum production was connected to sources of electricity from the beginning because you need so much electricity to make it. There was a U.S. monopoly company, the ones who held the whole patent, which became the Aluminum Company of America, or Alcoa, and it set up a plant in 1895. Hall, so about 10 years after Hall actually showed that you could produce aluminum using this process, set up a plant right next to Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls has a lot of water. It's falling down. And the next step for Alcoa, once they discovered this process, was to set up a second plant. The first one was in the United States, just on the American side of the river. The next was to move to the province of Quebec, to Shawinigan, next to a hydro project there in 1900. And the big step in the development of the aluminum industry in Canada was the arrival in 1912 of this man, James Buchanan Duke, after whom Duke University is named. He made his money in tobacco, cigarettes, in fact. And, this was in North Carolina, where a lot of tobacco was grown. And after that, he went into cotton production, and then in order to make cotton, he needed electricity to power the cotton mills, and so he built dams along rivers in North and South Carolina. And in 1912, he went to the Saguenay River up in the province of Quebec, and there was a drop from Lake Saint Jean to Chicoutimi, a distance of, 30 or 40 kilometers. Over that space, the river dropped 100 meters. It's the biggest drop anywhere in North America. I only say North America because I know that for sure. It may, and probably a much wider area. So there was great potential. He and a local partner bought the water rights to the river. Couldn't do it now, but you could do it then. And already the province of Quebec was getting a little careful about this because in the Saint Maurice Valley, where Shawinigan is, where that earlier plant was, in 1912, the province had set up a commission because they were getting worried about the amount of water that was being diverted to produce electricity, and it was having some environmental impact on things like fish and birds. Duke's original idea was to generate power for Boston. But the problem was, and it's still a problem with electricity, if you ship it, as you ship it, you lose some. And the further you send it, the more you lose. Originally, Edison wanted to ship it using direct current, which means you could only send it about, I exaggerate, maybe a kilometer. So that meant there were a lot of small power stations, but the shift to alternating current meant you could send them further, send the energy further, but in 1912 or 1920, which is what we're talking about, over about 100 kilometers, you were going to have trouble. And getting power from up in Quebec to Boston just wasn't going to pay. So what was needed was a large industrial user on the site that would use the electricity from this potential electricity. The answer was to find an investor, a company that needed a lot of electricity. The Aluminum Company of America was the answer. And the Aluminum Company of America had as its father, Andrew Mellon, who spent time as the Secretary of the Treasury when he wasn't running a bank and 2 or 3 other industries. Oh, they owned an oil company too. A very, very wealthy man from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 1922, it was necessary to get provincial approval to build a dam. And resistance, again for environmental reasons, from the province disappeared in 1920 when a new provincial government was elected in Quebec, headed by Louis-Alexandre Taschereau, and he wanted to promote industrial growth, especially in eastern Quebec. In 1922, Duke and his partner, who owned a pulp and paper mill, got permission to use the water from the lake and to raise the level of the lake behind the falls on the Saguenay River to produce electricity. In 1926, the Aluminium power station opened, and there were also two smaller dams built to control water going into the lake, in the process flooding whole villages and driving people from their homes. The result was this massive aluminum smelter at Jonquière outside of Chicoutimi, and it's now part of Chicoutimi, in fact. And that was just the beginning. Two more dams, one built in 1931, but as I remember, didn't produce much in the way of electricity until 1941, but they just kept it there just in case. And then the Shipshaw Dam in 1943, leading to a massive increase in electricity potential. The electricity wasn't exported, it was used domestically. This was in part because the technical problems of transmission made export impossible. The provincial government policy of promoting industry helped. The idea put some pressure on, or made it possible for action on the part of the company to produce aluminum with the electricity. It was also in part because of federal government policy. In 1907, the federal government passed the Fluid and Electricity Export Act. Fluid meant water, because there was a difference of opinion between the United States and Canada about how much water of Niagara Falls could be used to produce electricity. If you used too much of it, there would be no Niagara Falls. You're sending it all into turning generators. And in fact, in some parts of Canada, falls have disappeared completely. The rivers have disappeared completely, all the water being used to produce electricity. But also behind that too, you had to get a license to export water. In a sense, there had to be an agreement between Canada and the United States about how much water would be used by each side of Niagara Falls, and in general along all riverways that were borders of the country. But the idea also was, to some degree, to keep the water power in the country, part of the national policy. And again, the national policy, the idea was to bring in U.S. investment. Well, this was the federal law followed a process that Ruth talked about in Ontario, where this man, Adam Beck, small manufacturer, I think it was cigar boxes in London, Ontario, he began around 1900 to make sure that the power from Niagara Falls stayed in Ontario. And the result in 1906 was the setting up of this commission, and by 1910, a public power company. And they built, at the time, the world's largest hydroelectric power plant, generating plant in 1923, only to be exceeded by the Aluminium project up on the Saguenay River just a couple of years later, which was built. This for small manufacturers in Ontario, the other for one big manufacturer, Alcoa, or I should say Alcan, the Aluminum Company of Canada, which was a subsidiary of the American company. Alcan increased its capacity through the 1930s, but sales didn't go up. The 1930s was a good time to sell much of anything anywhere in the world. And so they had all this spare capacity around. The theory is that they kept the spare capacity around to scare off competitors, because they could just produce more. They had lots of electricity. All they had to do was flip a switch. The nice thing about hydroelectric power, you got all this water sitting there in the reservoir, and you can turn it on anytime you want, and so long as there's water there, and just let it flow, and all of a sudden you have power. But it also is sustained power, and you need sustained power in order to keep the industrial process going. If you turn off an aluminum producing pot, it takes a long time to clean it out and start it up again. Well, so this expansion in capacity meant that the company was well prepared for what happened beginning on the 1st of September 1939, and even better prepared for what happened on the 7th of December 1941. Tremendous expansion in output during World War II, because aluminum was a principal component of airplanes, and the first Britain and then the United States decided that Canada was the place where all the aluminum would be made. After World War II, there was fear of a market collapse because there weren't airplanes being made anymore, but much to the good fortune of the aluminum industry, the Korean War came along, and things got better, and Alcan went and built a massive and fully owned operation in British Columbia, even going so far as to turn the Nechako River around and have the water come out at this end rather than that end, so they could produce electricity for a massive smelter in northern British Columbia. Canada was one of the top producers of aluminum in the world. I'm sorry I couldn't find you more recent data than 2009, but the results would be similar. Middle East production has gone up. Production in Iceland's gone up too. But notice that Canada, 50% more than Australia, considerably more than the United States. In other words, per capita, Canada is, and even though the Chinese number is very high, per capita, Canada is still one of, if not the the biggest producer of aluminum in the world. I guess the ultimate question, the one I raised before, or at the beginning, was whether this whole process fit in with the national policy. Did, in fact, the national policy succeed? Did the system of making the aluminum in Canada mean that energy was not exported, instead it was made into some industrial product? Well, I wish I could tell you the answer is simple. It's not. This is a comparison of total electricity consumption in Canada and aluminum production. And you can see they more or less move together. In other words, it seems the economy expands in general along the same lines in both cases, with some fluctuations, a war thrown in here and there, a depression, something like that. But the general trend is much the same. Electricity exports grew, it's true, especially in the late 1960s when the government relented and there was much greater integration of North American electricity production and exchange thanks to better systems of transmission. But still, and transmission problems were lessened by technological advances. And the government of Quebec liked the idea of exporting electricity. But still, the one thing where it looks like there is joint development is in the increase in hydroelectric production and in aluminum production. That there, the whole operation, the two are coordinated. And that the use of electricity, hydroelectric power, to produce aluminum was connected with hydroelectric production. So the policy to promote industry was a bit vague, and certainly it allowed environmental damage, and the effects of dams and smelters was dismissed by political authorities in general until the end of the 20th century. The presence of the resource, geography trumps everything, right? There was lots of water and many sharp drops in the Laurentian Shield, which made it possible for the development of all these dams, and especially very large dams. The government, if it was not friendly, at least it didn't put up too many barriers to the development. And so long as the industry owned the dams, which is what happened, Alcan owned all their own dams until very, very recently. They had complete control over the source of electricity. I hope, although it is true that geography certainly mattered and created the possibilities, what I've tried to claim, and I would insist on, is that technological changes, not only in how you make aluminum, but also how you make electricity, how efficient you are at making the aluminum with the electricity, and how expensive transmission is, that had an impact on all the developments I've told you about. That politics did matter and had an effect on the pace and character of the development, and the market mattered. The demand for aluminum and for electricity. And those factors combined to shape the structure and ultimate success of the Canadian aluminum industry. So, thank you very much.